Picture Jerusalem in the early 6th century BCE, a proud city about to fall, as the armies of Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar swept through Judah, laying siege to the holy city and carrying off not only its treasures but also its brightest young nobles, intending to reshape them into loyal servants of the Babylonian court. And among these captives was a teenage boy named Daniel, along with 3 companions who would become known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for young men torn from their homeland and thrust into the heart of the most powerful empire on earth, yet who would go on to become some of the most enduring symbols of unwavering faith in religious history. Brought into the royal palace, Daniel and his friends were selected for an elite training program designed to turn them into Babylonian courtiers, given new Babylonian names to replace their Hebrew identities, and offered a daily portion of the king's own rich food and wine. Yet Daniel quietly resolved not to defile himself by eating food that violated the dietary laws of his faith, and rather than openly refuse the king's order and risk execution, he proposed a respectful compromise to the official in charge: allow him and his 3 friends to eat only vegetables and water for 10 days, and then compare their health to the other young men who ate from the royal table. The official reluctantly agreed, and at the end of the trial period, Daniel and his companions appeared healthier and stronger than all the others who had feasted on royal delicacies, and God granted the 4 of them extraordinary wisdom and understanding, with Daniel in particular gifted with the rare ability to interpret dreams and visions, a skill that would soon prove indispensable to the very empire that had enslaved him. Not long after, King Nebuchadnezzar was tormented by a disturbing dream that left him deeply shaken, yet in his paranoia he refused to simply describe the dream to his wise men, and demanded instead that they tell him both the dream's content and its meaning without being told anything at all, threatening execution for every astrologer, magician, and sorcerer in Babylon if they failed. None of the king's wise men could meet this impossible demand, and as the death sentence was about to be carried out against all the wise men of Babylon, including Daniel and his companions, Daniel calmly requested time from the king, then gathered his friends in prayer, asking God to reveal the mystery to them. And that very night, the dream and its interpretation were revealed to Daniel in a vision. Brought before Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel described the king's dream in full: a towering statue with a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of iron mixed with clay, before a stone cut without human hands struck the statue's feet and shattered the entire structure, with the stone then growing into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Daniel explained that this vision represented a succession of great kingdoms, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar's own Babylonian empire represented by the golden head, followed by weaker kingdoms symbolized by the silver, bronze, and iron sections, and ending with a divine kingdom, represented by the stone, that would ultimately outlast and surpass every human empire that came before it. Astonished and humbled, Nebuchadnezzar fell before Daniel, declared that Daniel's God was truly a God above all gods, and elevated Daniel to a position of great authority over the province of Babylon, while Daniel in turn requested that his 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also be placed in positions of administrative power. Yet Nebuchadnezzar's humility proved short-lived, for some time later, in an act of overwhelming pride, the king constructed an enormous golden statue and commanded that every official across his empire bow down and worship it whenever royal music played, under penalty of being thrown alive into a blazing furnace. When the music sounded, every official bowed to the golden statue, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who, faithful to their God, refused to bow before any idol, and their defiance was quickly reported to the furious king. Nebuchadnezzar gave the 3 young men one final chance to comply, but they answered him with remarkable courage, declaring that their God was able to save them from the furnace, but even if he chose not to, they would still refuse to worship any god but their own. Enraged, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, so intensely that the soldiers who threw the 3 men inside were themselves killed by the heat. Yet when the king looked into the flames, he saw not 3 men but 4 figures walking unharmed inside the fire, and he called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out, finding that not even their clothing smelled of smoke or their hair had been singed. Witnessing this miracle, Nebuchadnezzar once again praised their God and issued a decree protecting the worship of the God of Israel throughout his empire, though his own pride would soon return, leading to a later episode in which he was struck with a strange affliction, driven from his throne to live for a time like a wild animal in the fields, until he acknowledged that the true God ruled over the kingdoms of men, after which his sanity and throne were restored to him. Years passed, and after Nebuchadnezzar's death, his successor Belshazzar held a great feast, and in a shocking act of sacrilege, ordered that the sacred golden and silver vessels looted from the temple in Jerusalem be brought out, so that his nobles could drink wine from them while praising idols of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. In the middle of this drunken celebration, a disembodied human hand suddenly appeared and began writing mysterious words directly onto the plaster wall of the banquet hall, and Belshazzar, terrified, watched the color drain from his own face as his knees knocked together in fear. None of the king's wise men could read or interpret the strange writing, and at the queen's suggestion Daniel, now an old man, was summoned to the feast, and he interpreted the message without hesitation, telling Belshazzar that the words meant his kingdom had been numbered and brought to an end, that he had been weighed on the scales and found wanting, and that his kingdom would be divided between the Medes and the Persians. And that very night, as history records, Belshazzar was killed and Babylon fell to the invading Persian forces, fulfilling Daniel's interpretation almost immediately. Under the new Persian administration, Daniel, now well advanced in years, continued to serve in high office under King Darius, who held him in such high esteem that he planned to place Daniel above all other officials in the kingdom, a decision that provoked deep jealousy among Daniel's political rivals, who searched for some fault in his conduct but could find none, since Daniel remained scrupulously honest and faithful in both his public duties and his private devotion to God. Unable to find any wrongdoing, these rivals devised a trap based entirely on Daniel's unshakable faith. They convinced King Darius to sign an irrevocable decree forbidding anyone from praying to any god or man other than the king himself for 30 days, under penalty of being thrown into a den of lions, knowing full well that Daniel prayed openly to his God 3 times a day and would never abandon this practice, even to save his own life. True to his character, Daniel continued praying exactly as he always had, kneeling by his open window facing Jerusalem 3 times daily, and his rivals, watching closely, reported his defiance to the king, forcing Darius, despite his genuine affection for Daniel, to reluctantly enforce the very law he had been tricked into signing. Daniel was cast into the den of lions, and a stone was placed over its entrance, sealed with the king's own signet ring so that nothing could be altered, and Darius, deeply distressed, spent the entire night unable to sleep or eat, worrying over the fate of his most trusted advisor. At the very first light of dawn, the anxious king rushed to the den and cried out, asking whether Daniel's God had been able to save him, and to his overwhelming relief, Daniel's voice answered from within, explaining that God had sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, protecting him through the entire night because he had been found innocent before God. Overjoyed, Darius ordered Daniel lifted from the den unharmed, not a single scratch upon him, and in a reversal of fortune, commanded that the men who had conspired against Daniel be thrown into the same den along with their families, where the lions, no longer restrained, immediately overpowered them, and Darius then issued a decree honoring the God of Daniel across his entire kingdom, declaring him the living God whose dominion would never end. Beyond these famous narrative episodes, the Book of Daniel is equally renowned for its series of prophetic visions, in which Daniel foresaw future kingdoms rising and falling in patterns strikingly similar to Nebuchadnezzar's earlier dream, visions involving powerful symbolic beasts emerging from the sea, culminating in prophecies concerning what many later religious traditions would interpret as a coming messianic kingdom that would ultimately triumph over every worldly empire, prophecies that would go on to profoundly influence Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic eschatological thought for centuries to come. Looking back across the entire narrative of Daniel's life today, what emerges is not merely a series of miraculous rescues, but the portrait of a man who maintained absolute integrity across an astonishing 70 years of service under multiple foreign kings and shifting political regimes, who rose from a captured teenage exile to become one of the most trusted advisors in 2 successive world empires, all while never once compromising his core convictions, whether facing the threat of unfamiliar food, a blazing furnace, or a den of ravenous lions. His story has echoed for over 2,500 years precisely because it speaks to a universal human struggle, the tension between worldly power and personal conviction, between the pressure to conform and the courage to stand apart. And it is this enduring message, that unwavering faith can withstand even the fiercest trials a hostile world can devise. that has made Daniel one of the most beloved and frequently retold figures across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike, a timeless reminder that integrity, patience, and quiet courage can outlast empires, kings, and even the mouths of lions themselves.